Good day, God's people. Welcome to our Sunday school lessons for this week. We move on to lesson 11 with the topic, God in the Divided Kingdom. We already saw from the last lesson how God divided the kingdom of Israel into two, placing Rehoboam and Jeroboam in the southern and northern kingdoms respectively. In this lesson, we will look at how the kings that followed in each of these kingdoms fared. Our memory verse is taken from 1 Kings chapter 14 and verse 8. It says, "And I tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. And yet you have not been as my servant David, who kept my commandments and who followed me with all his heart to do only what was right in my eyes." This lesson has two divisions as usual. Number one, God in the northern administration and God in the southern administration. Today we'll look at division 1, God in the northern administration, under the headings A, makes David's legacy the yardstick, and B, most kings cannot match it. We begin now with the first part. In our memory verse, we see God sending a message to Jeroboam. We see from these verses that God had purposely been the one behind raising those who served as kings in Israel. This is not the first judgment against a king in Israel that we will be hearing God pronounce. The first was against Saul, who was the first king. We heard his pronouncement against Solomon when he went astray, which of course was also passed on to Rehoboam. Even David, who was well acknowledged by God, got some judgment himself in 2 Samuel chapter 12. These just show to us that humans are imperfect beings, and as such, human administrations are imperfect. But in the verse we read, we see David being used as a standard or yardstick with which Jeroboam was judged. Why did God choose to use David as a comparison? 2 lessons ago, we quoted from Acts chapter 13 and verse 22, where God gave a testimony about David. God had sought a man after his heart, a man who would follow him solely and do what he wants. That was what David did. David had a relationship with God. His heart yearned for God. He desired God's presence always. His focus was to please God right from his youth, and his position as king did not change that. He didn't follow traditions. He followed God. This is what God wants of us. He wants our sole focus to be Him. He summed up all the law into, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. What God requires is simple. Have a loyal relationship with Him. Even today, there are many who go to church but are not following God. They are religious but not godly. Is there a man who seeks God? Are we not self-seeking, even in our so-called acts of righteousness? God seeks men like David who will depend solely on Him. By following God, He Himself helps us to fulfill the requirements of His righteousness. With men, it is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. So David's legacy of following God and depending on Him solely was the yardstick that God used in measuring the acts of the other kings, like Jeroboam here. The second part says, most kings cannot match it. This is talking about the kings of the northern kingdom and how they fared in respect with the legacy of David. The kings that followed Jeroboam in the northern kingdom did not fare well. Their ends were equally ungodly. In 1 Kings chapter 15, from verse 25, we see summaries of Nadab, son of Jeroboam, and Baasha, who followed him. Both had negative testimonies. They did evil in God's sight and led Israel to sin. In chapter 16, we see the accounts of Elah, Zimri, and of Omri, kings of Israel. They all did not follow God. They followed the acts of Jeroboam. Each king that came in did worse than the one before him. Unrighteousness became the tradition. And then we read of Ahab, who got married to the popular Jezebel and did many acts against God. God used Jehu to bring judgment to him. In 2 Kings, we read of other kings like Ahaziah, Joram, and even Jehu, who did not also show the godly attitude that was testified of David. From 2 Kings chapter 13 through 16, kings like Jehoahaz, Jehoash, and then the another Jeroboam still refused to turn the tides around and live for God. When not following God becomes the norm, people don't remember God anymore. The situations only become worse, and we still face that today. Even in our churches today, many are not in ministry or positions to fulfill God's purpose. Many don't even know His purpose. They follow traditions, good or bad. They seek fame, people's respect, riches and all. The devil is in an all-out battle against the church, and as long as he is able to capture the hearts of the leaders, he can have the followers as well. Leaders must not lose focus. Wherever you are, or whatever you may have done, it is not too late to return to God's original purpose. What are you seeking? Are you following God, or you are merely following human traditions? Human administrations will continue to fall short of God's standards because God is not in them. No matter how good they look, they will always fail without God. Only when a leader allows God to lead him will he be able to walk and lead others well also. Our lessons learned. 1. God's standard is high, but His requirement is simple. What He desires is our humility and our readiness to walk with Him. He Himself will bring His righteous purpose to pass. 2. As long as we continue to make the wrong choice of leaving God out of our lives and leadership, the trend will only become worse and consequences are sure to follow. We have looked in summary at the kings of the northern kingdom. Next week, we will look at the kings of the southern kingdom. Till then, let's follow the lessons from today's Sunday school. Do have a great week ahead.